You ever wake up one morning and realize the entire neighborhood thinks your property belongs to them? That's exactly how my second day at Silverwood Lake started. I had barely finished unloading the last of my moving boxes when the sound of boat engines drifted across the water outside my cabin. Not one engine. Several. The kind of low rumble that carries across a lake at sunrise when the air is still cool and the water looks like polished glass. I stepped onto the wooden porch with a mug of coffee still steaming in my hand and watched 3 boats glide toward the docks behind my house like they'd done it 100 times before. The smell of lake water and gasoline hung in the air. At first I figured they were just passing through. Maybe a couple of neighbors out for an early morning ride. But they didn't pass through. They tied up, one by one. Like the docks behind my cabin were some kind of community marina. I stood there for a moment, listening to ropes creak against the wood pilings, watching strangers step onto the planks I'd assumed came with the property I'd just bought. Nobody waved. Nobody asked permission. They just walked across the docks, chatting like they owned the place. That was the first sign something strange was going on in this neighborhood. My name's Ethan Caldwell, and 2 weeks ago I bought what the real estate listing called a quiet lakefront retreat just outside a small town in northern Michigan. 42 years old, recently divorced, software engineer who finally decided I was tired of city noise, traffic lights, and neighbors who thought a parking spot was worth an argument. I wanted quiet. A place where the loudest thing in the morning would be loons calling across the water or the crunch of gravel under my truck tires. The property looked perfect on paper. A cedar cabin built in the late 80s, about 1,800 square feet, sitting on just under 2 acres of land with 200 feet of shoreline. The previous owner had passed away the year before, and his kids had already moved out of state. The listing mentioned private lake access and existing dock infrastructure. At the time, I assumed that meant a couple old boat docks that came with the shoreline. Nothing unusual about that. Lakes all over the Midwest are dotted with them. What the listing didn't mention was that those docks were apparently the center of an entire neighborhood's expectations. I took another sip of coffee and watched one of the boat owners walk straight across the grass toward my backyard like he was heading to his own house. The dock boards creaked under his boots. Another boat pulled in behind him. The morning sun climbed just high enough to light up the row of wooden platforms stretching across the water like a parking lot for boats. 17 docks in total. I hadn't counted them before. The cabin sat slightly uphill from the shoreline, and from the deck, you could see the whole lake curving around the treeline. It was the kind of view people frame in photographs. Calm water. Pine trees. Mist lifting off the surface. Peaceful. Except now it wasn't peaceful at all. Because the more I watched, the more it looked like those docks were a lot busier than any private property should be. A third boat tied off. Then a fourth. Laughter drifted across the water. Someone fired up a small generator on a pontoon. The steady hum echoed across the lake like background noise at a marina. I remember thinking one simple thing while I stood there on that porch. Either I had just bought the most popular shoreline on the lake, or the entire neighborhood believed something about my property that I didn't know yet. And about 20 minutes later, when 3 golf carts rolled down my gravel driveway carrying the Willowbrook Estates HOA board, I finally learned exactly what that something was. The gravel on my driveway crunched before I even saw them. That slow electric whir of golf cart motors carried through the morning air, mixing with the smell of lake water and pine trees. I turned just in time to watch 3 white golf carts roll past the front gate like they had every right in the world to be there. Nobody stopped. Nobody knocked. They drove straight toward the back of the property where the shoreline opened up. By the time I reached the yard, the first cart had already stopped beside the old oak tree near the docks. A woman stepped out like she was arriving at a meeting she had scheduled weeks ago. Mid-50s, perfectly styled blonde hair, white tennis outfit that probably cost more than my entire moving budget, and sunglasses large enough to reflect the lake behind me. She held a leather folder tucked neatly under her arm like it was some kind of official badge. 2 other people climbed out of the carts behind her, both carrying clipboards. The woman glanced toward the docks first, scanning the boats tied up along the row of platforms, then turned her attention to me like she had finally located the person she came to see. Her smile was polite, but it had that tight, practiced look people use when they already assume they are in charge. "Good morning," she said, walking forward across the grass. "You must be the new owner." Her voice had that calm, confident tone that sounded less like a question and more like a confirmation. I set my coffee mug on the porch railing and walked down the steps toward them. Ethan Caldwell, I said. Just moved in yesterday. She nodded slowly like she had already read that somewhere. Linda Hawthorne, she replied. President of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. She gestured casually toward the lake behind me. And this is our community shoreline. The way she said our made something in the back of my mind pause for a second. I looked past her toward the docks where the boat owners were still unloading coolers and fishing gear like nothing unusual was happening. Community shoreline? I asked. Linda opened the folder and slid out a neat stack of printed papers. The pages fluttered slightly in the breeze coming off the water. The residents of Willowbrook have used these docks for over 20 years, she said, handing me the top page like it was standard procedure. Boat access, fishing access, recreational access. It is all organized through the association. I glanced down at the paper. It looked like a meeting agenda or some kind of community policy sheet. Nothing that resembled an actual legal document. I think there may be some confusion, I said carefully, gesturing toward the cabin behind me. This property includes the shoreline. Linda's smile did not move. Not even a little. Yes, she said calmly. You own the house. She turned slightly and pointed toward the row of docks stretching across the water. But the lake access belongs to the neighborhood. The two board members behind her nodded quietly like they had already rehearsed the conversation. One of them checked something on a clipboard while the other looked out across the boats like he was supervising a marina inspection. The breeze shifted again and the wooden planks of the docks creaked softly under the weight of people moving around. Somewhere out on the lake a pontoon engine started up, the low rumble echoing across the water. I looked from the boats to the shoreline, then back to the folder in Linda Hawthorne's hands. Something about the whole situation felt strange. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just strangely certain. Like they had all arrived expecting this conversation to end one very specific way. For a moment nobody spoke. The only sound was the gentle slap of water against the dock pilings and the distant buzz of another boat crossing the far side of the lake. Linda Hawthorne stood there with the patience of someone who had delivered this speech before. The sun reflected off her sunglasses so brightly that I could not see her eyes, only my own reflection standing in the grass between the cabin and the shoreline. I picked up the paper she had handed me and scanned the page. It looked like a homeowners association notice printed from a standard office template. Community access schedule, dock etiquette guidelines, boat slip numbering. Everything about it suggested organization and long-standing routines. What it did not include anywhere was a deed, a survey, or anything that resembled legal ownership. I looked up again toward the docks. A man in a blue fishing shirt waved to one of the pontoon drivers like they had been meeting there for years. You said residents have used these docks for 20 years, I said. Linda nodded smoothly. Correct. Before I bought the property. Yes. She said it casually, as if the timeline was completely normal. The man with the clipboard behind her flipped a page and cleared his throat. The previous owner allowed shared lake access as part of a community agreement, he said. Everyone in Willowbrook has maintained the docks together for decades. Maintained together. That phrase hung in the air for a second while a breeze carried the scent of sunscreen and gasoline from the boats. I glanced down the shoreline again. 17 docks stretched out across the water like wooden fingers reaching into the lake. Each one had different cleats, ropes, and ladders attached. None of them looked new. Weathered boards, faded bumpers, metal brackets darkened by years of lake water. If the story was true, the docks had probably been there longer than most of the houses in the subdivision behind the trees. Linda shifted her weight slightly and folded her arms, still holding that folder like a symbol of authority. We wanted to introduce ourselves early, she said. Most new homeowners appreciate understanding how the lake community operates. I noticed the word operate this time. Not share. Not visit. Operate. The boats tied along the docks rocked gently in the wake of another vessel passing further out on the lake. One of the pontoon passengers laughed loudly, the sound drifting across the water like background noise at a small marina. My cabin porch, my yard, my shoreline. And apparently a system that had been running long before I arrived. I crouched down near the grass where the shoreline met the wooden walkway that led to the first dock. The boards creaked under my weight as I stepped onto them. Solid construction. Pressure-treated beams. Steel bolts sunk deep into concrete footings. Whoever built these docks had not done it as a temporary project. They were anchored permanently into the ground beneath the waterline. I looked back toward Linda Hawthorne. "Let me make sure I understand," I said calmly. "The association believes these docks belong to the neighborhood." Linda's smile returned instantly, confident and satisfied, like the conversation was finally moving in the direction she expected. "Exactly," she said. "It has always worked that way." The wind shifted again, brushing across the lake and rattling the ropes tied to the cleats. The sound echoed softly across the row of docks. 17 platforms. 17 sets of anchors sunk into the lakebed somewhere beneath the surface. And as I stood there listening to the wood creak under my boots, one quiet thought slipped into the back of my mind. Not about the water, not about the boats, about what those docks were actually attached to underneath all that water. The boards beneath my boots creaked again as I walked a few steps farther along the dock, the lake water slapping softly against the wooden supports below. I could feel Linda Hawthorne watching me from the grass behind the shoreline, waiting for the moment when I would accept the arrangement she had just described. That calm confidence in her voice had not sounded like someone asking permission. It sounded like someone explaining rules that had already been decided years ago. I crouched down and ran my hand along the edge of the dock rail. The wood was rough and sun-faded, worn smooth in spots where ropes had rubbed against it for years. Whoever built this system had done serious work. Thick pilings disappeared straight down into the water. Steel brackets held the walkway together with bolts that had clearly survived decades of Michigan winters. Nothing about it looked temporary. I stood up again and looked across the line of platforms stretching out over the lake. 17 docks, each one large enough to hold a fishing boat or a pontoon. Each one connected by narrow walkways that branched off the main path, like a wooden street running out across the water. Behind me, Linda cleared her throat gently. "The association also collects a small seasonal maintenance fee," she said. "It helps cover repairs, shoreline cleanup, and dock upkeep." I turned slightly toward her. "Maintenance fee?" "Yes," she replied smoothly. $150 per boat each season. It has kept everything running smoothly for a long time." The man with the clipboard nodded again and wrote something down, like the conversation had already reached its conclusion. A breeze rolled across the lake and lifted the surface into small ripples that tapped lightly against the dock supports. I stepped farther out along the walkway until I reached the second platform. From there I could see almost the entire shoreline curve around Silverwood Lake. Tall pines lined the far edge of the water, their reflections stretching across the surface like dark brush strokes. It really was a beautiful place. Quiet, calm, the kind of property people search for years to find. I looked down again toward the base of the dock where the pilings disappeared under the water. The lake was clear enough near the shoreline that I could see several feet below the surface. Dark posts extended down into the lake bed where they were set deep into the ground. Solid anchors. Permanent foundations. I had worked with enough construction projects during my life to know what permanent infrastructure looked like. These docks were not floating platforms that drifted with the water. They were fixed structures attached directly into the ground beneath the lake. I straightened up slowly and turned back toward the yard. Linda Hawthorne stood exactly where she had been before, arms folded lightly, her sunglasses reflecting the lake behind me. She looked relaxed now, like she expected the next thing out of my mouth to be agreement. "So everything stays the same," she said calmly. "Residents continue using the docks. The association handles coordination, and we all enjoy the lake together." One of the boat owners out on the water waved toward the shore, clearly assuming the conversation was already settled. I walked back along the dock boards toward the grass, the wood creaking rhythmically under my steps. When I reached the shoreline again, I paused and looked once more at the long row of platforms stretching into the lake behind me. 17 docks, anchored firmly into something beneath the surface. Linda Hawthorne tilted her head slightly. "Any questions?" she asked. I looked from the docks to the folder in her hands, then back toward the water again. "Just one," I said quietly. "Do you happen to know exactly where those dock foundations are anchored?" For the first time since she stepped out of that golf cart, the confident smile on Linda Hawthorne's face hesitated for just a fraction of a second. The brief pause in Linda Hawthorne's smile was subtle enough that most people probably would not have noticed it. But I did. The breeze moved across the lake again, rattling the ropes tied along the dock cleats, and carrying the faint smell of gasoline from a pontoon boat idling somewhere farther out on the water. Linda adjusted the folder in her hands like she was buying herself a moment to think. "The docks have been there for years," she said finally, her voice still calm but a little more careful now. "Long before you purchased the property." I nodded slowly, glancing back toward the long row of platforms stretching across the lake behind me. "I believe that," I said. But that was not exactly my question. The man with the clipboard shifted his weight slightly beside the golf cart, clearly sensing that the conversation had changed direction. Linda tilted her head, studying me over the rim of those large sunglasses. "What exactly are you asking?" she said. I pointed out toward the water where the dock supports disappeared beneath the surface. "Those pilings," I explained. "They are not floating docks. They are anchored." Linda followed my gesture. Toward the water, then back to me again. "Yes," she said. "That is how docks work." I smiled slightly. "Right," I said. "But anchors have to be set into something." The wind picked up again, and the boards of the nearest dock creaked softly as one of the boat owners walked across it carrying a cooler. From the shoreline, I could see the dark posts disappearing down through the clear lake water until they vanished into the sand and gravel below. Solid construction. Permanent supports. I had seen enough building projects in my life to know that kind of work required permits, plans, and a place to secure the foundation. Linda shifted her stance again and crossed one arm across the folder, now resting against her hip. "Ethan," she said, using my first name for the first time like she was trying to soften the conversation. "The association has coordinated lake access here for decades. The previous owner understood that arrangement." I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment while another boat passed slowly along the far edge of the lake. The wake rolled toward shore in small waves that tapped against the dock supports. "Maybe he did," I said quietly. "But arrangements and ownership are not the same thing." One of the board members looked down at his clipboard again, flipping through several pages like he was searching for something specific. Linda watched me carefully now. "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. I turned slightly toward the shoreline where the grass met the start of the wooden walkway. From that angle, the entire row of docks lined up across the water like a long wooden spine stretching out from the edge of the property. 17 platforms. 17 sets of pilings disappearing into the lake bed. And every single one of them connected back to the narrow strip of land directly behind my cabin. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air coming off the lake. "I am suggesting something simple," I said. "Those dock foundations have to be anchored into land somewhere beneath that water." Linda did not respond right away this time. The breeze shifted again, stirring the pine branches above the shoreline and sending small ripples across the surface of the lake. Finally she spoke. "Yes," she said cautiously. "Into the lake bed." I nodded once. "Exactly." I looked down at the edge of the property line where the shoreline curved along the water in front of the cabin. The place where land gradually disappeared beneath the lake's surface. "And the lake bed along this section of shoreline," I said calmly, "is part of the property I just bought." The quiet that followed was not dramatic. No shouting. No sudden arguments. Just the sound of wind moving across the lake and the faint creak of wood from 17 docks that suddenly felt a little less certain about who they belonged to. For a few seconds nobody spoke. The wind moved across the lake, pushing small ripples toward the shoreline where they tapped gently against the dock supports. Linda Hawthorne stood perfectly still, her sunglasses reflecting the row of platforms behind me. The man with the clipboard had stopped writing entirely. Even the boat owners farther out on the water seemed quieter now, their voices fading into the background hum of the lake. Linda finally let out a small breath through her nose. "The lake bed is public water," she said carefully. "That is how most lakes work." I nodded slowly. "Sometimes," I replied, "but not always." I stepped off the wooden walkway and onto the grass again, glancing toward the cabin where the stack of closing documents still sat inside on the kitchen counter. I had spent half the previous night flipping through those papers because moving into a new property always came with details. Survey maps, easement notes, property boundaries that looked like puzzle pieces when you first saw them on paper. At the time, I had mostly been checking utility lines and shoreline restrictions. Now those pages were starting to matter a lot more. Linda adjusted the folder under her arm. "The previous owner never raised any issue about the docks," she said. The association has operated this access system peacefully for decades. The phrase operated again. I noticed it immediately. Not shared. Not borrowed. Operated. I turned back toward the water where the dock supports disappeared into the clear shallows near the shore. That may be true, I said. But peaceful arrangements only last as long as everyone understands the paperwork. The man beside the golf cart looked up from his clipboard again, his eyebrows pulling together slightly. What paperwork? He asked. I pointed back toward the cabin behind me. The property survey that came with the sale, I said. It includes underwater boundary lines extending 30 feet from the shoreline. Linda did not respond right away. The breeze pushed a small wave against the nearest dock piling, and the wood creaked softly in response. 30 feet, she repeated slowly. Yes, I said. Which means the lakebed beneath those dock foundations is not community water. I gestured out across the line of platforms again. From that angle, you could see exactly where the supports dropped into the lakebed, each one standing like a post marking a permanent position in the ground beneath the water. Those pilings are anchored inside that boundary, I explained calmly. Every single one of them. The quiet that followed was heavier this time. Linda removed her sunglasses slowly, folding them in one hand while she looked out toward the docks again. Without the reflection on the lenses, I could finally see her eyes studying the shoreline carefully for the first time since she arrived. The board member beside the cart flipped through his clipboard pages faster now, scanning whatever notes he had written earlier. That does not sound right, he muttered under his breath. I shrugged slightly. It might be, I said, or it might not be. I glanced once more toward the cabin where the survey map was waiting inside. But I am very curious to find out. Linda Hawthorne stared at the docks again, the confident certainty from earlier in the morning slowly draining out of her expression as the wind moved across the lake, and 17 anchored platforms creaked quietly in the water like they were suddenly waiting for someone to check the fine print. The silence stretched longer this time. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the kind of quiet that settles over a conversation when everyone suddenly realizes the rules they thought were permanent might actually be temporary. Linda Hawthorne slowly slipped her sunglasses back onto her face, but the confident posture she had carried when she first stepped out of that golf cart was gone now. Her eyes moved from the docks to the shoreline, then back toward the cabin behind me like she was mentally retracing something she had never needed to question before. One of the boats tied along the outer platform shifted as a small wave rolled under it, the rope tightening against the cleat with a soft creak. The sound echoed across the water. 17 docks. 17 sets of pilings. And suddenly nobody seemed quite as comfortable standing next to them. The board member with the clipboard cleared his throat and flipped another page, the paper rustling loudly in the quiet air. The association installed several of those docks, he said cautiously, like he was testing the statement out loud. Residents contributed to the materials. I nodded once. I am sure they did, I said calmly. They are well built. I walked a few steps toward the shoreline again, looking down into the water where the first row of pilings disappeared beneath the surface. The lake was calm enough that the reflection of the docks stretched out like dark shadows beneath the platforms. Permanent shadows anchored into the lakebed. The question is not who paid for the wood, I continued. The question is where the foundations are set. Linda folded her arms again, but this time the gesture looked more defensive than confident. Even if what you are saying is correct, she said, these docks have been used by the community for years. That establishes a precedent. The word precedent floated across the yard like it had legal weight behind it. I leaned slightly against the railing at the start of the walkway and watched another pontoon boat glide slowly across the lake about 50 yards offshore. Maybe, I said, but precedent does not override a property boundary. The breeze shifted again, carrying the smell of sunscreen and lake water across the grass. One of the boat owners down the dock had stopped unloading gear and was now watching the conversation from a distance, clearly trying to figure out why the homeowners association board looked suddenly uncertain. Linda glanced toward the docks again. For the first time since she arrived, she was not smiling at all. So what exactly are you proposing? She asked. Her voice was still controlled, but the easy certainty from earlier had disappeared. I looked out across the water again, letting the quiet of the lake sit between us for a moment before answering. Nothing dramatic, I said finally. Just clarity. The board member with the clipboard frowned slightly. Clarity. I nodded toward the cabin behind me. There is a licensed surveyor in town, I said. I plan to have him confirm the underwater boundary lines. Linda did not speak. The breeze moved through the pine trees again, sending small ripples across the lake that tapped against the dock supports in a slow rhythm. I continued calmly. If those pilings are inside the property line, then they are anchored into land that belongs to this parcel. The board member lowered his clipboard slowly. And if they are, he asked. I looked out across the row of platforms stretching into the water, the ropes tightening slightly as another small wake rolled through the lake. Then those docks are not just sitting on the lake, I said quietly. They are sitting on my land. 3 days later the lake looked completely different to me. The water was still the same quiet blue, the pine trees still framed the shoreline, and the row of docks still stretched out across the surface like a wooden street floating above the lake. But now every creak of the boards sounded different, like the structure itself was waiting for an answer nobody had asked before. The surveyor arrived early that morning in a faded pickup truck with a metal tripod rattling in the bed. His name was Carl Whitaker, a licensed land surveyor who had been mapping property lines around northern Michigan for almost 30 years. When he stepped out of the truck, he took one long look across the shoreline and gave a low whistle. That is a lot of dock for one parcel, he said. I nodded toward the water. That is exactly what I was thinking. Carl unpacked his equipment slowly and began setting up near the edge of the yard where the grass met the sand along the lake. The metal legs of the tripod clicked into place while the laser instrument on top rotated quietly, scanning the shoreline. The breeze carried the soft hum of the equipment across the water while several boat owners watched from the docks with open curiosity. Word had already spread through Willowbrook Estates that something unusual was happening at the lakefront cabin. Linda Hawthorne arrived about 15 minutes later in the same white golf cart, this time without the confident entrance she had made earlier in the week. She parked near the oak tree and stepped out with her arms folded, watching the survey equipment like it might suddenly change its mind about where the boundary lines were. Carl worked methodically, walking along the shoreline and marking points with bright orange flags pushed into the sand. Each flag lined up with the laser measurement as he recorded coordinates on a handheld tablet. The quiet clicking of the instrument echoed across the yard while the boats drifted gently against their ropes. I stood beside him as he finished the last measurement and looked out toward the docks again. From the shoreline, you could see exactly where the pilings dropped into the lake bed. Carl squinted across the water for a moment, then checked the readings on the screen. Well, he said slowly. This is interesting. Linda stepped closer immediately. Interesting how? She asked. Carl pointed out toward the platforms stretching into the lake. Your underwater property boundary extends 30 feet from the shoreline, he explained. Every one of those dock supports is inside that line. The breeze moved across the lake again, rattling the ropes along the cleats. For a moment nobody spoke. Even the boat owners down the dock had stopped moving. Carl continued calmly, tapping the screen of the tablet with one finger. Technically speaking, he said, those docks are not sitting on public lake bed. Linda stared out at the row of platforms like she was seeing them for the first time. They are sitting on private property. I followed his gaze across the water where the pilings disappeared beneath the surface into the sand below. 17 docks. 17 foundations. All anchored exactly where the survey line said they were not supposed to be if the neighborhood actually owned them. Carl packed away the measuring pole and glanced toward me. You now control the land under every one of those dock supports, he said matter-of-factly. The wind brushed across the lake again, and the entire line of platforms creaked softly in the water like they had just realized something important about who they were standing on. The lake was quiet again by the time the surveyor packed up his tripod and drove away. The orange boundary flags still stood along the shoreline like small reminders that the ground beneath the water was not quite what the neighborhood had believed for the last 20 years. Carl Whitaker's truck disappeared down the gravel road, leaving behind the soft sound of wind moving through the pine trees and the slow creak of 17 docks rocking gently against their pilings. Linda Hawthorne had not said much after the survey results. She stood near the oak tree for several minutes looking out across the water, her arms folded tightly while the board member beside her kept flipping through his clipboard like he hoped the paperwork might suddenly contradict the measuring equipment. It did not. Eventually Linda stepped back into the golf cart without another word and drove away toward the Willowbrook subdivision. But the conversation was far from over. That evening the lake looked peaceful again, the kind of calm water that turns orange and gold when the sun begins dropping behind the tree line. A few of the boat owners were still tied to the docks, sitting quietly like they were waiting to hear what would happen next. I stood on the porch with another cup of coffee and watched the light reflect across the water. The property felt different now. Not louder, not tense, just clearer. The next morning, I walked down to the docks again with a folder in my hand. Inside were copies of the survey map Carl had confirmed, along with a simple document I had drafted the night before. Nothing aggressive, nothing dramatic, just a straightforward agreement. When Linda Hawthorne arrived later that afternoon, she stepped out of the golf cart much slower than the first time she had visited the property. This time she walked straight toward the shoreline and looked out at the row of docks before saying anything. "You called a meeting," she said quietly. I nodded and handed her the document. I thought clarity would help everyone. She opened the folder and scanned the page while the wind moved softly across the lake behind us. The agreement was simple. The residents of Willowbrook Estates could continue using the docks exactly as they always had. No one would lose access to the lake. No boats would need to move. But the structures anchored into the lake bed would now operate under a formal dock lease. Each platform would remain where it was, and the association could maintain them just like before. The only difference was recognition of the land beneath them. Linda read the last page slowly, then looked up toward the line of docks stretching into the water. The boards creaked gently as a boat rocked against its rope. "A lease," she said. $100 per dock each year. I replied calmly. 17 docks. 17 agreements. Nothing changes except the paperwork reflects reality. The quiet stretched between us while the sun lowered behind the trees and painted the lake in long streaks of gold. Finally, Linda closed the folder and looked back out at the water again. The confident certainty she had carried the first morning was gone, replaced by something quieter, something practical. "The association will review this," she said. I nodded once. Of course. The wind brushed across the lake again, and the wooden docks creaked softly in the evening air. 17 platforms anchored into the lake bed beneath the water, and now everyone understood exactly whose land they were standing on.